Okay, well, thank you all for being here. And so, you know, in talking to people about the new federal education law, there's I think there's sort of a really interesting tension, and people are seeing a lot of potential reward, you know, as it transitions more power back to states, but also potential risk, and there are a lot of folks who sort of feel both things simultaneously. You know, it's not an either-or situation. So we're, you know, going to start with you, Mike. And, you know, since you're the practitioner, you're the educator among us on the panel. So, you know, I just want to ask you, you know, from your perspective as a district superintendent, how prepared you feel at this point in terms of transitioning to ESSA, and what you think the biggest challenges are going to be.
Well, good morning. Thank you. You know, look, there is a lot of tension in the system, and I think the tension is between what I call compliance and innovation. I think we're ready in California. You know, California is kind of the naughty child state, I think, right now, because we've come ahead in a lot of ways, and we have a very aggressive state board of education here, and so. And I think, too, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, you know, as far as the implementation of the Common Core, mostly it's been quiet in California. And I think it has to do with the way our state superintendent of public instruction, Tom Torlakson, and the State Board of Education work together to really have more of an organic implementation here. And the other thing that was interesting for us is we never got into value-added teacher evaluation systems to determine teacher effectiveness. So I think that we're very hopeful in what's happening. I have a particular interest in the new assessments. I think that high quality assessment, efficient assessment, you know, helps lessen the burden of kind of the state summative assessments that are happening, and allows more time for instruction, project-based learning, kind of what we call the 4 C's, you know, spending time with students on those skills: communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. So I think we're very well positioned, and so I think that's I'm hopeful.
You're hopeful, okay. That's good to hear. So, Lydia, I wanted to turn to you. You, as part of the student voice team, designed a model state accountability system that has gotten some praise in Washington. Now, I don't know what the rest of you were doing when you were a high school student, but I was not designing a model accountability system, I will say that. So when you were working on that with your fellow students, you know, what did you learn throughout that process, and what were some of the main points you wanted to highlight in that system?
Well, first of all, we realized that education policy is really hard to understand, especially if you don't have a high school degree yet. They use a lot of really big words, and it requires a lot of research, and we see that kind of as a problem because students are an untapped resource when it comes to education policy. It's no secret that student engagement leads to increased student agency, which in turn creates a more productive learning environment. And so we see ESSA and just like this new wave of education reform as an opportunity for students in 2 key ways. The first of those being the opportunity to include student voice measures in school climate measures and hold schools accountable for that. The student voice team audited a middle school last spring, so about a year ago. And one of the most concerning things that we saw, and we surveyed all 800 students and all the staff of the school about like what the biggest problems that the students were seeing in the classroom. And I think 2/3 of the students said bullying in some way, shape, or form, and we didn't have a single member of the staff say the same thing. So obviously there's this huge disconnect between teachers and administrators and students, and if we want to really create an education reform that's going to be meaningful, we need to include student voices in this process.
You know, when you did that accountability model, I noticed that you put the most emphasis among the various gears and moving parts on student growth, which is, I think, something that a lot of people are interested in. Why did you do that?
the finer parts, especially when we talk about how much we weighted each thing, was because we really didn't understand the law. And so, like, I'm going to be completely honest, because I also wrote that we wrote that in January. So the law really, like, as we know it now, was not in existence. So we were really grasping at straws for, we were just basing it off of what we saw from places that we saw had effective school, like, assessments.
Sure. It had just been passed, a month ago. People were still trying to figure out what was in it and how it might work. Janel, I suspect you have a few responses in mind to what the senator just said with Steve. What would you say in terms of, when you look at the history of federal education law and civil rights and justice, when you look at ESSA, what do you see and how would you react to what Senator Alexander said?
Sure. Well, first of all, today is a really historic day. I am Senior Education Policy Counsel for the NAACP-Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the civil rights organization founded by the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And today, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which effectively invalidated what was essentially racial apartheid in our nation's schools. And sitting here 62 years later, I would love to say that we've come so far that all vestiges of racial segregation, racial isolation, and economic isolation were eliminated, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. The Department of Justice has over 150 open desegregation cases. LDF has over 100 open pending desegregation cases. But now we see educational inequities manifest themselves in very different ways. So school discipline disparities. So school climate is very important for us. I was so happy to see the weight that you put on school climate in your metrics, but I would have actually liked to see more weight on school climate. I work with a coalition called the Dignity in Schools Campaign, which is a national coalition of 106 organizations from 26 states focused on school discipline reform and improving school climate. Because if students aren't in school, they can't learn. They're losing quality instruction time. They're not getting that one-on-one interaction in that time. But we also see discrimination is perpetuated through discriminatory discipline policies. And we see that students who have historically been marginalized and pushed out of school, students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, are the same ones who are disproportionately targeted for overly punitive school discipline. So I, like Michael, though, am also hopeful, because I think that this is really an opportunity, as Lydia mentioned, to also include stakeholder input in a way that has been unprecedented in the education arena before. ESSA provides the opportunity, for instance, for needs assessments, where stakeholders, parents, community advocates, students, teachers can inform interventions in lower performing schools. That hasn't happened before. And so while in some ways I'm very disappointed to see any kind of reduction in the federal oversight role in education, I'm hopeful that the inclusiveness and the inclusion of ESSA, if it's properly implemented, can really inform and help stakeholders to shape what their state plans look like.
Yeah, so you mentioned, properly implementing it. You have this mix of, giving more authority to states and districts in deciding how to turn around schools, how to set academic goals and what goals to set. And then you have the issues that you just raised about school discipline and school climate, integration and segregation. Is that, when you put those two sort of aspects of this together, is it is it more of a challenge, or could it, really lead to some interesting approaches at the local level? What do you think?
I think if the implementation process is truly meaningful, and that word meaningful is actually in the statute. Chairman Alexander talked about the plain language of the statute. There should be meaningful stakeholder input. And if it's truly inclusive and meaningful, then stakeholders can really have a role in shaping interventions and shaping what the law looks like in their state. So when they're choosing their accountability indicators, I'm hoping they'll choose school climate and safety as one of their indicators. But what I'm hoping is they they shape their plan, their accountability, and they target their funding based on the input of stakeholders. So I'm hoping that they will target funding for restorative practices, for school-based mental health programs, for evidence-based practices that we know improve outcomes. I think we all agree that the test and punish culture of No Child Left Behind was broken, and that it did more to undermine educational outcomes than help them. But I also think that if we truly include the voices of stakeholders, there is some real potential here. I do want to just make a point about funding, because I know that that's the big issue coming up in the hearing tomorrow. And as a participant in the negotiated rulemaking committee, we were disappointed that we were not able to reach consensus on the issue of what's called supplement, not supplant, which I'm sorry, Lydia, that's a wonky way of just saying school funding, particularly for Title I schools that serve high numbers of low-income students. But the one thing I do think everyone at the table agreed upon is that districts serving high numbers of low-income students should certainly not be receiving less funding. And I believe that equitable doesn't mean equal, it means fair. It means giving students the supports and services that they need. Chairman Alexander mentioned comparability, another very wonky term, which refers to comparison in services. But what we've tried to promote, and I think a lot of advocates, particularly in the civil rights community, have really promoted, is this idea of looking at spending, actual expenditures, which, by the way, have to be reported in another section of the law, and saying that on average, spending in your Title I schools should not be less than your spending in your non-Title I schools. And I think everyone can agree that all students should be able to access quality education regardless of their zip code.
Yeah, it's a very contentious issue at the moment. Mike, I want to throw it to you, you're a superintendent, you deal with your community all the time. How do you think about making sure that, the buzzwords that we use about, community engagement, talking with parents and others who have a stake in the school. For example, ESSA for the first time in federal law requires schools to track English language proficiency for accountability. And as many of us know, the share of students who are learning English in our schools is rising. How do you think about that issue or other issues when you talk to your community and say, what do you want from your schools and what do you want to change?
Yeah, in California, we have two things happening, and we're in our third year, just going into our third year in this fiscal cycle. And so one of them is the local control funding formula, which is a new distribution model where schools receive additional funds based on three types of students that they serve: low-income, foster youth, and English learners. And so my school district, Verde, we're 83% of our students are living in poverty according to federal guidelines. And so in that way, we've received significantly more dollars than school districts that don't serve that population, that high-need population. And so that's been fantastic. The other piece is, in California, you have something called the Local Control and Accountability Plan, which requires us to work with our community. And I hate to say require, but it really has been wonderful. I would have never predicted as an educator that 3 years ago we would be engaging with our community and our students in the way that we are today. So we have multiple stakeholder input meetings. And as a result of those things, some of the things that we've done, kind of getting down to the weeds a little bit, our parents in our community wanted they wanted the school district to pay for fingerprinting so that they could volunteer, because that fee for live scan printing for them to volunteer, that was a barrier. And so we set it up, and now we offer live scan fingerprinting right in our school district to make it easy. Parents communicated that they wanted childcare services, and so we're providing that. We've opened an entire family engagement center where we have bilingual workers that are welcoming and accepting of our parents and families. We're doing a lot with connecting We have something in California called Covered California. And so we're ensuring that many more of our families are receiving access to healthcare. In that Family Engagement Center this year, to date, we're a school district of about 20,000 students. We've had over 6,000 parents visit our Family Engagement Center. And we really use a strength-based engagement model with our parents. And so I think that a lot of the promise of ESSA we're actually carrying out in California now with tremendous results. And I think one of the things the previous speaker mentioned was this concept of true community engagement. And I think if that happens,
right,
there's a beautiful thing that occurs in the way that we're able to engage with our families, serve our students in a much better way. And I just want to say lastly that California also, State Board of Education voted recently to include suspension and chronic absenteeism as a measure of state accountability, which I'm very excited about because, again, it speaks to making sure that the students are coming to school and that we're really working on getting kids in, getting them engaged. And then the other thing is it really does highlight the inequity in suspension across races. And so that's something we've been very passionate about.
So maybe California is going from the naughty child to the golden boy, potentially. You know, Lydia, I don't know if,
I would
please,
love,
go ahead.
I would love to hop in on that.
Yeah,
One
please.
thing that we, as students, noticed when we went to the Fordham Institute to talk about our accountability system is that when talking about school climate measures, a lot of people were talking about this idea of chronic absenteeism. But one thing that I don't think a lot of adults understand or think about is that I'm a chronic absentee student. If you were to track that measure, you'd get me in there. And I miss a lot of school because I do a lot of events like these. Well, I mean, so I mean, not a lot, but I mean, I do miss a lot of school because I'm doing advocacy work. I'm 18 years old, and so my school day looks a lot different than other people's. So when you look at something like chronic absenteeism, you need to also look at why a student is absent all the time. So that's just one example of how having a student in the room in a conversation can bring up something that, adults just don't think about.
So
Yeah, that's if I could jump in.
That's great. Well, all right, Lydia.
that's a great way to put it. I want to leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. Please make it brief and succinct. If you want to make an extensive comment, you should talk to the Atlantic about coming up here next year. But for now, just make it a short question, please. Do we have a question over there? Yes.
Hi, my name is James Thompson. I just wanted to follow on with this absenteeism. Why is it, I come from obviously by my accent another country, why is it that mandatory attendance equals education?
That's right.
I don't understand that. I'd love somebody to explain the thinking process behind it.
That's a good question. I have no answer.
And do you think ESSA addresses that at all?
I just want to address that actually on the flip side and going back to school climate. When students are not in school, they can't learn. When you're losing out on that quality instruction time in the general classroom, you are losing critical instruction. That's why districts that have higher suspension rates also have poor student outcomes because they're missing out on that quality time. So I agree with Lydia's point, though, that you have to look behind the numbers. There was a study years ago in Baltimore about chronic absenteeism. They found the number one reason for the chronic absenteeism was asthma. As a result of lead in the paint. So we have to look behind the numbers and not just have this attitude of blame towards students. We have to understand a little bit more about what's behind that and how we can address some of the root causes.
And maybe really understand your communities before you leap into, grabbing at an indicator that you think is important.
And that's why locally developed interventions are really important too.
Absolutely. We
Yeah,
have
I would
another
agree with
question.
that.
Oh, Mike, quickly, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, our chronic absenteeism rates in my school district are greatest at kindergarten and a senior at high school. So I think it's a bit of a misconception to think that, it's really the middle grades. And for those kindergartners, getting them into the habit of coming to school every day, realizing, look, they can't be taught if they're not in the seat.
Right. Over here. Yes.
Hello, I'm Eileen Solomon, teacher and George Washington University alumni from School of Education. I wanted to know what you all think about, we talked about years ago that students would be spending more time at home with their computers, and that a lot of classes now in campus, in universities and schools are being taught on the internet rather than coming into the schools, which become, I mean, it's fine, it's great to have social service agencies for the families, but I think that there should be a division between academic and social service agencies. So the question is, what do you think about the idea that was floated years ago about children staying home and learning their academic on the internet, as we do on college campuses and in public school systems in different states in the United States? Because I did a study on that. Thank you.
We don't have a lot of time, but Mike, I don't know if you want to address that, or Janelle, Mike, any experience you might have?
Yeah, look, we know, and research tells us for a long time, that learning is inherently social. And I think, I love the concept of personalized learning. I'm in California state, it's the same state as Silicon Valley, but I think that there's nothing that replaces the human contact. It's the same reason that Amazon hasn't killed off all the malls, because shopping is a social activity, right?
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Please give a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you.